In this video, we're going to have a look at the Bevel Tool in Maya 2012. Now, it's important to note, if you've ever used any other 3D software, that sometimes the names of different tools in different software packages are the same, but the tools are actually completely different. So in this case, for example, in Lightwave, the Bevel tool in Lightwave is actually the same as the Extrude tool in Maya, and the Bevel tool in Maya is completely different to the Bevel tool in Lightwave. So sometimes you will, when you're using different software packages, come across the same names for tools, but they're actually for completely different functions. So just keep that in mind if you're ever using a sort of a multiple software pipeline. So let's have a look at this Bevel tool. I'm going to start off with just a cube. Okay, there we go. So just a polygon cube. And I'm also going to use, I'm also going to create a more random shape under the mesh menu. I'm going to go down to create polygon tool. And I'm going to basically make a very randomly shaped polygon. Like that. It sort of randomly looks a bit like a duck. Okay, and I'm going to extrude that out a little bit just to give it some depth, like that. Okay. Now note that this polygon that I created and then extruded obviously has way more than 4 sides. Okay, but that's something that I would, if I was going to use this for a specific purpose, I would probably go through and actually use something like the interactive split tool and actually cut the surface of this up into, where possible, 4-sided polygons, just to kind of keep it within that that framework. Okay, so let's have a look at the way that the Bevel tool functions. I'm going to start off with this little duck object. Okay, so if I go up to the Edit Mesh menu, I can go right down to here and find the Bevel tool. And if I click on the little option box, that'll pop a little panel open. Now notice that some of the tools in Maya will pop the tool settings up over here in the Tool Settings tab. Some of them will pop up a floating window. Okay, so it's more or less the settings you see here would, for some tools, actually appear in this panel. And because obviously it's popping up a window, what I'm going to do is turn the tool settings panel off, just so I've got a bit more room to work with. So the Bevel tool works on the edges of an object rather than the polygons or the vertices. And what we need to do is create a selection of edges for the tool to function with. So I'm just going to select edge mode and I'm going to double click an edge. Now, what usually happens here is when you double click an edge, it should actually select edges all the way around the shape. However, because this is sort of a randomly created shape, it's not actually allowing me to create a selection in that manner, which is a bit of a pain. So I'm just going to have to select these like this. You'll find most of the time, especially with the basic primitive objects, that if you double click an edge, it will actually select right around, it'll follow the edge right around and select it all in one hit. But on occasion you might get these shapes where it doesn't work so much. Okay, so the way that this works is basically it's going to take these selected edges and it's going to create polygons. It's basically going to create a series of polygons running around these edges so that it rounds the edge off. And that's basically what the bevel is. So for example, currently, if I go to Edit Reset Settings, the default value for these for this tool, you can see here that we've got an offset type, fractional and absolute, and basically fractional just says prevents inside-out bevels. So what that technically what that should do is stop the polygons that are created from flipping inside out. However, you'll probably find, especially on sort of very, very tight corners, possibly like this, you might get overlapping polygons anyway, and maybe up here. We've then got offset space, world or local. So what the world value does, it basically it's supposed to ignore the size of the object when it bevels. So the size of the bevel that we get, which is kind of determined by this width, it's really a trial and error kind of thing. You've got to kind of, usually you start off maybe with the default setting and apply that and see what happens, and then basically dial it up and down depending on whether it's too big or too small. And obviously you undo in between those stages. So more or less the offset space is supposed to dictate whether or not it's working off sort of the units on the grid or taking its basic scale off the overall size of the object. But I tend to find it's not really a logical thing. So you don't really need to worry about any of these settings at the top here. The number of segments basically is how many polygons each edge divides into. So with a segment of 1, you'll basically get 1 polygon edge running around here. If you set it to 2, you'll get 2 polygons running parallel to one another all the way around, and that's where it starts to actually round off. If you set it to 1, you'll get a little 45-degree angle edge. So let's just have a look and see what happens. So if I hit apply, you can see that basically the default value is working on a 0.5 width. And that 0.5 width, really, if we have a look at the size of that width compared to the grid, it's about the same width as the grid. So in this situation, you would kind of assume if it's working off world, which is based on the grid size, and the width is 0.5, you would kind of expect it to be half the width of the grid. But you can see here it's not really doing that. It's kind of making it almost like almost the full grid width. So even though the bevel has worked, it's probably a bit bigger than I expected it to be. So you can see the basic principle. What it's doing is rounding the top of that edge out that was selected. Now, if I need to undo that because I'm not quite happy with the result, what I need to do is make sure that I've kind of moved the viewport a little bit like this. Just hold down Option and just wiggle it around a bit. And that means that the panel is actually, the viewport is active. And then if I go up to Edit, Undo, which is just here, it'll remove the bevel and then reselect those edges again. And then I can come back into the bevel options and change the numbers and then reapply. Now, if you hit Apply, it will put whatever settings you've got here onto the object, but it doesn't close the panel off. If you hit Bevel, it'll put whatever the options are onto the object, but it then shuts this panel down. And if you need to tweak it, you've got to go back up to the Edit Mesh menu and select Bevel again, or Bevel Options. So it's usually best to just use Apply until you're happy with the settings. And once you're happy with the settings, you can just close the panel off manually. So let's change that width. I'm going to drop it down to 0.15 because I want it to be a little bit less than half of what a little bit less than half of the size that it already was. And the segments I'm going to change to 3 because I want it to be more of a rounded bevel. And then I'll hit Apply. So you can see now it's quite different to what it was just before. And if we zoom in here like this, you can see it's actually added a rounded edge that's quite a bit smaller than it was previously. If I switch back to object mode for a minute, you can kind of see the result that that's had. So it's added a little rounded edge. So that's basically what the Bevel tool does. Okay. And if I smooth that out, you can kind of see I get this nice little edge on it.